Good evening, fellow word lovers, mostly fellow Albertans. I'm so glad you could come, and I'm so glad I could be your local guest this year, so thank you. Since it is apparently important for writers to have goals, I have a few disparate ones for my keynote. So one is to motivate you. Two is to pick up on something Lisa said, and that is dealing with the self-doubt monster that can roar up in a lot of our heads. And the third is to explain the meaning of life. Someone told me once, aim high. So we shall see how I do swinging that bat. And fourth, perhaps on the opposite spectrum, and you may wish to take an intermission now, is to recite classic poetry. But let's get this meaning of life stuff over with, shall we? As you may have heard earlier this week, acclaimed literary author Toni Morrison died at the age of 88. And in October 1993, when some of you may not have been born, and when I was finishing up a university degree, Ms. Morrison received the Nobel Prize for Literature. And she closed her speech with saying this, and these are her words: "We die. That may be the meaning of life. But we do language, and that may be the measure of our lives." And my goodness, this room is filled with people who do language, and I am so delighted to be amongst my people. And I do think Ms. Morrison is right, that we can measure our lives by how we do language. She didn't say we should measure our lives by having an agent, which is a really good thing since I parted ways with mine last month. Toni Morrison didn't say we should measure our lives by having these really, really strong book sales, which is also a good thing for me, but more on that later. But she said, measure our lives by language, and doing language is why we're here. Meaning of life? Check. Thank you, Ms. Morrison. Sometimes I think it's hard to remember that even successful writers like Toni Morrison have had struggles too. And I was reading a lot of interviews this week because it stopped me from having to sit down and write this keynote. And and I read that when her first novel, which she was an editor for a while, and her first novel was is called The Bluest Eye. And she would wake up at 4 a.m. To write this, and she was a single mother at the time. She also, early within the past 10 years, lost her son to cancer, and she stopped writing for a while. So she understood the struggle of being a writer and a mom, being a writer and someone who suffers tragedy. But yet she returned to do language. She found solace in doing language. So I have no idea how Ms. Morrison dealt with self-doubt. I didn't go too deep down the Google hole on that one. But I do know it can paralyze writers, both published and unpublished. Too quickly, we listen to that voice in our head that tells us we're no good. That voice in our head that tells us we'll never make it. That voice in our head that tells us that what we just typed was the worst sentence ever written in the history of the English language. But I'm going to let you in on a little secret I've learned in the past year, not even from Google, but Google might be involved in a second. That's why I keep kind of checking my phone. But anyways, we shall see. So it helps to tame the bad voice in your head if you give it a name. Now, this I learned from my husband, who apparently has a really loud voice in his head, and he calls this voice the Viking. I try not to take offense at this because my people were actually Vikings. And anyways, marital confessions aside, I've named the voice in my head, and her name is Mabel. Mabel is not nice. Mabel reminds me lots of things, which I really hope aren't true. And I'm going to reference something now by NPR broadcaster Ira Glass. If you ever listen to This American Life, this is something he said, and you can find it on YouTube. But he talks about the gap evident in creators. And he says that the problem when we come to writing as readers, right? We have to know how to read before we know how to write. And when we get to the stage where we really want to write, we can usually recognize what good writing is. And then we come in. And we're novices. And there is the gap. And that gap does not close very easily. That gap stays. And what he says is that most people quit way too early because they know what good is. And what this is not good yet. So Mabel tells me that gap will never close. That I know I wouldn't even attempt to measure myself against Toni Morrison, so that's not even in the realm. But Mabel encourages me to sometimes to quit, or to go on Google or Twitter, because that's easier and I can do that well, rather than writing. But, I have a way to deal with Mabel now. This is only about 2 months old, so this is relatively new. And if you have a voice in your head that says bad things, this isn't the voice that says, I think that beginning could be a little better. And you're like, yeah, I think you're right. This is the voice that really is negative and is stepping on you. What you do is you channel your inner Samuel L. Jackson. Ideally from Pulp Fiction. It doesn't matter if you have seen Pulp Fiction, because here's another confession, not of the marital type. I haven't. And there's a reason I haven't seen Pulp Fiction. Back in October 1993, and yes, that was when Toni Morrison was busy winning her Nobel Prize, I lost my trust for Mr. Tarantino. In October 1993, my grandmother died quite suddenly, and I was in university in Ontario, and I found out in the morning, and I made arrangements to fly home the next day. So I had a night to waste, and I needed to distract myself. So as we often do when we seek to distract ourselves, we find other people's stories. I went to the movies with a friend. So we didn't really plan this ahead of time. It was actually after I broke down crying in the supermarket. She said, let's go to a movie, which was good, a good friend. The movie, the lighthearted comedy we were going to see, was sold out. And so this is before iPhones, 1993, and we looked up and said, oh, True Romance, that seems like fun. A good rom-com. So yes, I grieved my grandmother's death through some Tarantino gunfire. In spite of this, I remain a Samuel L. Jackson fan, and since Pulp Fiction is one of my husband's favorite movies, I've learned a quote or two in my 19 years of marriage. It helps me survive the marriage. The thing is, one of these Pulp Fiction quotes is enormously helpful with that self-doubt monster in your head. So, we'll see if I can get this. It's gone. My phone's gone to sleep, of course. How does it do this? Okay. So, when your voice in your head tells you, you'll never be as creative as Diana Gabaldon, this is what you tell it.
I don't remember asking you a goddamn thing.
I do this all the time. I was clipping this clip and getting on my phone yesterday. I have 15-year-old twins at home, and I kept playing this over and they're like, Mom, what are you doing? To which I said,
I don't remember asking you again.
So it can work with your kids, too. But regardless, if the voice tells you, why don't you have an agent yet? Why, your subplot is suckier than suck, and you should really quit writing right now, you can say, I don't remember asking you a goddamn thing. So, I encourage you to adopt this or a similar clip of your choosing. So now, how do I go from pulp fiction to classic poetry? I probably shouldn't. I had you laughing. But anyways, let's just throw this all out there. One of the things Mabel tells me, and maybe she might be a tiny bit right here, is it's a good thing I have a full-time teaching job because I don't have to live in the back of my minivan with my family. But truth is I love teaching, and I teach high school, and I teach creative writing to high school students and English, and I'm beginning my 25th year in the classroom in just 3 short weeks. And whenever I teach a grade 12 English class, as I am this coming year, I start the class the first day by reciting some of the lines from Tennyson's Ulysses. So this is a classic, you're going, oh my gosh, I'm going back to English 30, kill me now. But anyways, in this classic narrative poem, the speaker, who is not Tennyson himself, he's Ulysses, Odysseus, he invites his mariners to come on a voyage with him, to leave the safety of the shores, to seek new adventure that comes when you leave stable land. And if you want to look it up, I encourage you to Google, actually, Helen Mirren does a beautiful reading of it on the Colbert Report. So if you want to see the tradition or hear the traditional one or part of it. Anyways, as I was preparing this keynote, I thought about When Words Collide and how this conference is not only about words colliding, but also about people who do language colliding in the best possible way as they embark on yet another journey, yet another manuscript, yet another revision, yet more unstable land. And so, with apologies to Tennyson, and I do hope he and Toni Morrison are doing tequila shots in a bar in the afterlife, maybe with Stan Lee as bartender. But I have rewritten a little bit of Ulysses for When Words Collide, and this is how I'm going to end. So this could be my downfall, but what the heck? We go down together. My fellow writers, souls that have toiled and wrought and thought with words, that ever with eager anticipation opened the empty document and plopped your butt in the chair and opposed distraction, especially rewriting the final season of Game of Thrones. You and I are storytellers, and our stories have their place, at least until death closes all. But sometime before our death comes, some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming writers who strive to publish and to change, if not the world, then at least ourselves. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek newer words. Open a document, sit hunched over a laptop, unless you're Arthur Slade using a treadmill desk, and while silencing your inner voice, type and then type some more. For our purpose holds to weave stories that lie within us until we die. It may be that our editors will shut us down. It may be we shall reach the bestseller list and unseat the great J.K. Rowling or Rob Sawyer, whom we know. Though the obstacles remain, we will persevere, because that which we are, one equal temper of when words collide loving scribes, made weak by our unanswered queries or caustic reviews on Goodreads, but strong in will to live, to write, to do language, and never to yield to the voice who we never remember asking a goddamn thing. Thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. I'm curious. Can I get a show of hands? Who has not seen Pulp Fiction?
Oh, wow.
That is a lot more than I expected. You're not alone. I implore you, go out and see it. It's a great film.
We can meet tonight.
Or you can form a club. We will never see Pulp Fiction Club.